It's always very difficult to make an assessment of a budget because usually finance ministers always present the budget as something that addresses multiple constituencies, MSMEs, farmers, unemployed, youth, people with disabilities, gender issues, etc., etc. And every budget has details of approximately 130 schemes. So any comprehensive assessment of what a budget does would take several hours, and I'm not really sure that anybody knows how to do it. So I'm going to sort of try to compress my assessment of the budget onto in four broad categories. And as a backdrop to that, of course, is the fact that we're currently going through a revival process from a very deep contraction last year. And then there's the issue of how much growth can we expect in the years ahead. So, keeping that in mind, the four areas that I want to comment on in the budget, one is what's the budget's macro stance? Is that kind of consistent with the growth kind of stuff that we have in mind? Second, what's it done on taxation? Does it sort of again move the system in the directions that our slogans suggest we want to move? What do we want to say on expenditure uh, as another component? And finally, a much broader range of what you might call economic reforms, because budgets refer to all these things. So I'm just kind of going to slice the budget up into these four categories. So, first, budget stance. I think the critical thing in the budget stance is that is the stance for the current year consistent with the desire for getting a recovery? The NSSO has actually said that, they've given an estimate of recovery of about 9.2%, which is actually based on reasonably hard data that they have for the first 6 months and partial data on the rest. And I think some of the information that has been coming out after the first 6 months suggests that the pace of recovery is not going to be as robust as was originally thought. So, you know, it's not really clear. If we were to grow by 9.2% this year, we would end up with a GDP more than 1% above to 2019-20. Whereas I think it may well be the case that we end up with something more or less like 1920. There's no doubt in my mind there's a recovery, but it could be that the 9.2 is slightly exaggerating the recovery. Now, in that context, for the current year, since we still have a good 2 months left of the current year, and traditionally a lot of expenditure is concentrated in the last quarter. So I think there was an impression earlier that expenditure wasn't coming quite up to what people expected. And on the other hand, there was a boom in revenues. And there was some talk that maybe she will want to come with a fiscal deficit below the targeted 6.8%. My view was always that this would be a mistake. People were quite happy accepting 6.8, and it was pulling up an economy from a very low level. So the balance of advantage lay in taking a risk in stepping up demand. So I'm glad that she's gone for the 6.9. That does mean that she's expecting a lot of expenditure to happen. And actually, that's not usually very difficult because most of the times the government is holding back expenditure. So I think that's a good thing. Now, turning to next year. As far as next year's stance is concerned, I think most people expected that given that we had a huge fiscal deficit in 2020-21, 9 point something percent, and we're going to have 6.9 in 21-22, we need to do a little gentle kind of gliding towards a longer term aim, but very far from what was being talked about earlier. And I think that uh, reducing the fiscal deficit expectationally by half a percentage point was the right thing to do. So the macro stance that she has outlined for the year 22-23 is also correct. Now the question is this macro stance based on what? And I mean, is it an attempt to boost consumption, which many people were asking for because consumption is down? Or is it aimed at investment? Well, it's clearly aimed at investment. And I think she was right in that because, consumption is essentially derived from income. And income was low because employment was low. And there was this K shaped element also, where people in the bottom group were much worse hit than, let's say, people in the middle or the upper middle. And I think she could have actually, if you ask me, done a little more on Magnarega because the budget shows that although there was a huge expansion of Magnarega, it's now going to go back to what it was earlier. My view is that I don't think the economy is recovering that fast. But Magnarega is a demand determined scheme. So she can always make provision for this later by simply making it plain to the states that please fulfill all the demands for employment that you're getting, and we will provide you the money. And also the, what's it called, the PM Garib Kalyan Yojana, the free food, the 5 kgs free food. That could also be easily continued for another 3 months or 4 months if you felt that there was a need to do that. I don't know. I don't think it's actually provided for, but again, the amount's not very large. I was not in favor of using this opportunity, which many people were saying that this time to consider universal basic income. I think that's just wrong. Uh, there may be a case for a universal basic income, but that's a structural change. And that's not something you do in the middle of a panic. In the middle of a panic, you take emergency measures which are reversible. And I think these are the right measures to take. I'm actually glad that she didn't introduce an urban unemployment program or an urban employment program. Nothing is more likely to be misused than that. And I'm just surprised at the number of people who said maybe the time has come to have an urban employment program. Actually, the urban employment program should be the recovery of the economy because when the economy recovers, people will come back. And then there's the issue of how do you make the quality of their employment a little better, not starting some government employment scheme. This may sound a bit heartless, but I think it's probably the right thing to do. So, in terms of expenditure, my only regret, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, you know, she hasn't provided enough for vaccinations. Because if you look at the current year, the provision is 39,000 crores, and next year is 5,000 crores transfers to the states for vaccination. Now, I feel that I think the budget would have gained credibility if she had used the opportunity to give a loud and clear signal that we slipped a bit on our targets. Let's accept that because we said 100% of adults by December. We didn't get there. We were 62. In fact, I had commented that 100% was a bit exaggerated. And frankly, even if we got 80%, that would be pretty good. Well, we didn't get 80%. We got 62. But in the remaining 3 months of the year, we'll probably make up quite a bit of that and get pretty close to 100% double jabbed. But the fact is that every one of these guys will need a booster in the next year. So I don't see how 39,000 can go down to 5,000. That, to my mind, is a problem, and I think we are, by not highlighting a determination to do something, we're missing something there. I personally also think operationally, she should have said, look, we are placing advance orders on the vaccine manufacturers for so much for the course of the year. So get yourself organized to produce. And if you want to export beyond what the government wants, you're free to do that. So that way they could really, They know that the base is established and they can go beyond that. I think that would have been a good thing. She didn't do that. That's fair enough. Taxation. The best thing about taxation is she didn't do anything. There's a lot of nervousness on business whenever people say, oh, we must take care of the fiscal deficit, tax ratios are low. India's tax ratios are low. And I think we need a systemic reform, but not a reform pulled out of a secret process in the budget where nobody knows what you're thinking about. So I'm glad that she didn't do anything on taxation, except some fiddly marginal things here and there, which don't add up to very much. So I think on taxation, I give the budget high marks, principally for observing the Hippocratic rule of first of all, do no harm. And I think she's done no harm, so that's good. Now we come to the question of reforms, because you're asking for 8.5, whatever percent growth next year. And the truth is that in the current year, 9.2% growth in the current year after 13.7, according to the official figures in the first 6 months, means that in the second 6 months, the average growth is going to be less than 5%, just on a averaging between the two. So, in a way, the government's own figures suggest that the current growth rate is about 5%, which is more or less what the growth was in the 2 years before the pandemic. So it's not a big surprise. Now, you want a much higher growth rate than that, and which is good. But the question is that likely? And obviously, you've done the demand stimulus, etc., factored into the macro stance led by capital expenditure. I mean, that raises many questions of implementation because, we have a long history of so we're going to do all these wonderful infrastructure projects and then land clearance prevents them from getting done and then expenditure doesn't take place. But I'm assuming that they will make sure that that works. But that's not going to be enough. I mean, if you want a revival of private investment, it has to be led by a perception that lots of good reforms are actually taking place. And, I mean, I think there is a list of reforms. I think this government on privatization has given a much clearer signal. But although there's a huge shortfall in privatization from the current year's target, next year's target is substantially reduced. It doesn't matter because this year's target was they only made 8% of it. So even if next year's target is 50% of this year's, they actually meet it, that will be quite substantial. But I think getting privatization actually done will mean a mindset transfer. But will it happen? That is something, it requires an understanding of why the civil service is hesitant. And I mean, let me, as a former civil servant, there's good reason why they're hesitant. Because all of them feel that if they sell something off, it will be in the interest of someone or the other to say that this was a scam and money was lost, you sold it at too low a price. Either there is some politically mandated process where a very firm decision is taken and a very clear system is worked out to actually price a product. Otherwise, it's very difficult to believe that pricing will take place. So in Air India, it was good that it got sold, but the only reason it got sold was that the government was actually willing to take on the debt so that they sweetened the end result. Now, if there are similar requirements in coming public sector sales, will that be done? I don't know. The other thing is that, it's relatively easy to do disinvestment because you're just sort of saying, I'm selling so many shares, put in your demand for shares, and you have a transparent process. When you're asking somebody to take over a project, the competition is much more limited. I mean, the number of people who will bid is very small. And so then the question is that, the if you like, the uh, reserve price becomes very crucial. Because the only thing that protects the civil servant is that I sold it to the highest bidder with a decent reserve price. I mean, anybody will buy something for 5 rupees. So, how are we going to handle that? It's not very clear to me uh, whether that is being effectively handled or not. But still, give them credit that they're saying they're going to do it. And the other thing is that the political side will have an incentive to get it done. Because having failed miserably in the realization this year, if we fail again next year, then the only honest thing to do would be to say we don't believe in privatization anymore, or we can't do it. And that to my mind, I think one of the biggest reforms that would actually increase the credibility of the government is to undertake the reforms on GST. Now, what needs to be done is very clear, but what has happened is, since this has to be done in the GST Council, a kind of a convention has established that Parliament has nothing to do with it. I would have been happier if the finance minister had taken the House into confidence. And I've written about this in an article I wrote in Mint, saying that, look, this has to be done by the GST Council, but let me tell you what I'm going to propose and put it out there in Parliament. There's no reason why Parliament cannot discuss whether the government of India's proposal to the GST Council makes sense. Of course, it will get politicized, but in that process, there's a lot of steam gets let off, and a possibility of getting to a consensus emerges. If you don't do that and leave it to the GST Council, I don't believe they're going to get a solution. I personally think that in the GST, to move the GST forward, and I made this suggestion in my article in Mint, that the way to do that is to offer a compromise. The states are saying that, look, you haven't compensated us for the shortfall, and in any case, this compensation scheme ends in June of this coming year. We want it extended, they say, for 5 years. So you do a compromise. You say extend it for 3 years in return for you guys signing on to this structure change. The additional burden on the central deficit will be small compared to the structural change in GST that would be brought about. So I personally think that would have been a wonderful thing to do, but it wasn't done. Um, I think that what they've done on MSMEs is very sensible, extending credit guarantees. But the real problem is that these credit guarantees, I mean, MSMEs don't get credit, but they've actually been clobbered with huge equity losses. So merely saddling them with more debt is not going to be a solution. So I don't know how we can get around that, but the credit guarantee will at least let the more efficient MSMEs get more time. So if a credit guarantee is on low enough cost terms, it amounts to an equity support. So I think that's a good thing, and let's see how it goes. The biggest emptiness is in banking. You know, we've known that banks need to be recapitalized, banks needed to be reformed. I won't go on and on about it, but there's a lot on the banking reform agenda short of privatization. And it's not going to be easy for the government to privatize. I mean, part of the problem with privatizing the banks is, how do you get a competitive bidding system when the winning bidder has to pass the test of fit and proper? So it's very unlikely that several people will apply, pass the test, and then bid, and will bid high enough given the sort of valuations we place. So really, what we needed was removal of finance ministry control on most of the existing public sector banks while keeping them public sector, and I think strengthening the IBC, which somehow has got gutted. And while the finance minister talked about these asset reconstruction bodies, I think there are some flaws there, because the asset reconstruction, the body to whom the assets will be moved is a public sector dominated body. That body will get a private sector dominated body to find the best bidders, but it's the first body that will decide whether the bids are good enough. So it's really not very different from the banks themselves. And if these fellows are subject to all the procedural constraints that the public sector is subject to, then I think it won't necessarily be very easy to get agreement on what the value, what is an acceptable haircut for these things. Uh, I mean, if that wasn't a problem, then we don't need any of this stuff. We could just do it anyway. So I think that's those. Are, yeah, one other area. I had hoped that we would get a signal from the budget that on the issue of import duties, we are not going to go down the protectionist route. Now, I would say the signal, we didn't get a signal that we are. And some of what has been done on the customs duties is sort of rationalization. But I would have been, I think we need a clearer signal, particularly since we are going down the PLI route. The production linked incentives, the essence of the production linked incentive must be that there will be no further increase in protection. And you got to make do with this incentive. And I don't think we've got that sufficiently clearly. But many of these things are politically difficult to do. Uh, I think you could say that at least there hasn't been any major further increase in customs duties. What has happened is that exemptions have been removed. And in principle, removing exemptions is not a bad thing. So that's how I come out on the budget, and let's see how it turns out. But there's no doubt in my mind that if we display a growth rate of even a little below 9% for the current year, and we follow that up, I would say even with a 7.5% growth next year, that would be pretty good. And at least the government would then be judged by that, if you like, criterion or reference point.